Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Saving the World podcast with Luke McMichael and Martin Resney. Today, we're going to be talking about Protopia. It's a word we've mentioned many times before, but today we decided we're just going to really focus in on it, what it means to us, why we need the word Protopia, why we think it's a very important word to start using more often, get it into more futurist vocabulary, and really starting to kind of define the word on a deeper level, what it actually means, and why it's so important to everything that we're doing. So that being said, we're just going to jump right in. We're going to try to keep this briefer than some of our podcast to kind of make it fun and just really focus in on what this word Protopia means. So to start with, we'll just jump in. We'll give Martin a chance. So what does Protopia mean to you, Martin?
Well, it's actually pretty new to me as a term. I wasn't really familiar with it before you brought it up, but I do like it in the contrast specifically to Utopia, because Utopia and, well, dystopia obviously is not something that we want to achieve, but in terms of like Utopia as a thing that you want to achieve, it's unachievable. That's the the whole point. So there's always the simple counter argument to an extent that the word utopian is basically almost what do you call a pejorative term? Like it's not something that sounds like a good thing to try to even accomplish, especially in the context of like many utopias that were invented weren't really very great. Many of them tended to, like from our current point of view today, seem archaic. Even those that are not necessarily that old, because they usually are vaguely fascist. If you think about them, like many of the visions of the future, where if you look at or totalitarian, if you look at something like communism, how it sort of they saw themselves, even like Soviets, as like the utopians and achieving a utopia, and then it just makes the contrast to the reality of what they were doing even like that much more painful. But like the whole idea, like I'm not sure there is a utopian idea actually in futurism that I would say I really like, because like it's always like sort of an end state that's very far removed from our current situation, and it's not really great. So Protopia as like a moving in a direction towards something that's better than what we have now, I think is a much better concept.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the 2 points. So historically, the utopia and dystopia have been used a lot for almost hundreds of years. I think the first Utopia book was it Robert Moore or something from hundreds of
Well,
years ago.
coining the term, like you could argue there were actually proposed utopias that were older. Like you could go even to like Plato's Republic, like because he
Right.
basically what he did was propose a utopia. It just wasn't called a utopia yet.
Right. So the concept is utopia, one person's utopia being the perfect world where everybody's kind of the same, has, the same kind of concept. It's pretty much everybody else's dystopia. So utopia for one person, if you're trying to force that on everybody, it's essentially dystopia for everybody else. And that's where they're kind of the same thing in many ways. It's just a
It
kind of a
just
different way of looking at it.
let me give you like a one very quick example of how sort of silly it usually is, like especially when it was like done in the ancient times or in medieval times. Plato invented or proposed like a republic, a kind of a state where, like, guess who would be the leader? A philosopher king. And who turns out like Plato was a philosopher himself. So it's usually the people like, oh, I know what would be best for everyone if everyone was like me and I was ruling them.
Exactly. So I think that's the real core of why we need a new word, and why I'm so excited about this new word Protopia, and how it kind of just eliminates all the arguments about, oh, that's not my version of utopia, or that's not my version, that's a dystopia to me, that would be hell on earth. And we can kind of move
Just
away from all those negative arguments.
by the way, I accidentally pick a vote Loki mug
There you
today,
go.
so I think that's appropriate.
Loki's utopia. So that's, I think, the core concept of why we want to move past that. And we're moving towards a concept of progression, of always making things better, a place where things are constantly progressing. So Kevin Kelly coined the term. It's relatively new, 2011, only been around for 12 years. I don't think anyone ever used it before that. Extremely new as far as words go. And he just started it as kind of just a concept of kind of pronoia, which is the opposite of paranoia.
Oh,
where it's basically you just have this exuberant excitement and hope about the future. And the whole world is kind of working with you rather than against you.
So still being crazy, but in like a much more beneficial way to everyone.
Exactly, the opposite of paranoia. So that's kind of where he kind of thought about, the pro in Protopia, and just
No,
taking it to a
it
place
makes
where everyone's
sense.
excited.
It makes sense because Parsh is also part of like progressive or progression, but it also makes sense now that you say it in this way that like paranoia is what leads to dystopia.
Exactly.
Or at least it's connected to the idea of dystopia inherently. So what's the other thing that's then connected with not utopia in this case, but
Yeah.
protopia?
So utopia, dystopia are really the same thing if you look at it. And the opposite of the protopia, dystopia dynamic, of the utopia, dystopia dynamic is protopia, where it's basically you're excited about the future, you're trying to push forward. And one of the core concepts, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, is that it's not any one place. It's not a destination. It's multiple futures, any future you can imagine that would be good. Think of it as a little bit like if you're a fan of Japanese anime like me, then you have this isekai genre where they're constantly jumping into alternate worlds or realities. Like Sword Art Online is one of the best ones. That was one of the first ones, but there's literally hundreds of them now, where they basically take a random person from the world and just throw them into this alternate reality fantasy world, often some kind of gamer world. But it basically just shows a different world from his perspective.
Yeah, it just sounds extremely relevant to where our technology is going also.
Absolutely relevant. And I think we're all going to have these choices in the very near future, what kind of world we want to live in, whether it's a virtual world or a real world. We're going to have the power with replicators.
Yeah, that's actually you sort of I have to start responding because you're sort of really starting me thinking about a bunch of different ideas. One of those, like what you said just now, is where people want to be, they will have a choice what kind of future they want. Is sort of have you seen the movie? It was one of the movies based on Disneyland rides, but was taking itself seriously. But this one was a futuristic film.
Tomorrowland.
Yeah. Have you seen that?
Yes, absolutely. It was really good.
Yeah. So, it's sort of it wasn't a very successful movie, but like for futurists and the people like that, it's actually a very nice movie. But sort of there was the idea, and it's actually connecting with the other point I wanted to make, that a lot of these sort of utopias of the future are like fascist collectivist, and it's actually that's why there's a term for that genre now. It's called retro futuristic, and it's basically, or I especially like the way to phrase it from X-Men, like the Days of Future Past, this sort of future past thing, that it's like it's a future, but it's like feels like dated somehow. Right. It's like feels like a future from the past. So I think that's the general idea, and the point of the movie, or one of the points of the movie, was that the people were actually, it was like a machine that was influencing people to, through their sort of belief that everything's heading to a dystopia, to be actually heading to a dystopia. They just like tried to initially, I guess, to use the machine to warn people so that they don't end up in a dystopia, but then it sort of turns out that, I guess some spoilers, sort of turned out that the machine was actually reinforcing it. And there was more to that in the movie, but that's basically the idea of it's explaining in a quite clever way one of the dilemmas of futurism, or like trying to actually arrive, like a couple of the dilemmas of futurism and trying to arrive at a better future, particularly anything that you would want to call a utopia, was that, like, for starters, like, you can have a dated vision of the future that's, especially if it's the one the sort of collectivist centralized types, that it doesn't really work. And the other idea that, like, yeah, people can choose, like if they choose that they want to live in a dystopia, that's what's going to result like in the world ending as a dystopia. So it's actually very important, but I'm not sure like it was successfully answered by the movie. But like it's sort of important to find the answer of, okay, so how do you get people into a state of mind? Like, I guess now we have a word for that, the pronoia. Like, to get them into the state of mind where they would want to choose a future that's not a dystopia, and therefore result to like cause the world to not end up in a dystopia.
Absolutely. And the thing that excites me so much about it, and I've had many different conversations with different kinds of people, my son mostly, that he was very not able to kind of picture what that world would be like. And often you kind of, you imagine these dystopias where like the Borg are controlling everybody, or some random AI is taken over, Skynet's conquered us all and brainwashing us. The media, social media today
or
is...
there's like a mushroom zombie virus.
anything. So these are all concepts that are easy to imagine, and we've been kind of force-fed them for 50 years now, or even longer, just with all of our current stories. So the whole concept of Protopia is to move beyond all of that, to start peeling back the layers of each of these dystopian or utopian visions and figure out which ones we actually like. What parts of these do we like? And how do we find a world or create a protopian world that has multiple binary or multiple versions of each of these things that we can all kind of choose from? And I think the core concept is maximum choice for each individual in the world. Anything that improves your outlook and improves your freedom and improves your ability to choose the type of world you want to build and or live in is good. Anything that takes away from that is evil. And we've kind of talked about that dichotomy of good and evil a little bit, even though obviously it's gray. It's really gray, but the concept is more freedom, more choice, where you're not enslaving others or hurting others or abusing others. That's all good. Taking away from that, bad. But that concept being said, it's about progressing towards a world where we have more options and more ideas. So the core concept is protopian futures, plural. It's a plural future with multiple ideas, multiple things that could work. So again, just to throw it out there as an idea. So think hundreds of years in the future, perhaps. Maybe we've cured aging, maybe we haven't. Maybe we're immortal IT gods in some way.
I just don't like the immortal word, because in any sensible version, it's just life extension.
Life extension, exactly. So however you look at it, the concept is that each person could have access to a holodeck, access to a replicator, and access to as many people and or offspring or your family as you want. You could kind of build your own
through space.
Through space, you could kind of build your own, utopian, protopian vision. You can build your own protopian vision with as many people or as few people as you want, and have whatever kind of, and we'll use the word isekai, which is like alternate reality, alternate world.
In some kind of space.
Yeah, it's an alternate vision of your world.
It's just sort of like, now that you've put it this way, it's like, for someone it could be in virtual reality, because you can sort of create a virtual world or real estates infinitely, I guess. Or it could be like a space frontier kind of thing, that you move to space to start something new somewhere else. I guess the different, it just requires that there's some sort of a space over which you can have some sort of creative control that doesn't have to be the same for everyone.
Absolutely. So that's the core concept of Protopia. It opens up so many different ideas, and is really just about getting everybody to think about it. What is your Protopia? I used to ask the question, what is your utopia? Because I always kind of thought I used those words interchangeably. I didn't really understand the difference. But since I've had it explained to me by so many people in the last couple of years, after writing my first book, The 4 Pillars of Utopia, realizing that, that's not really, it's a loaded word. And I'm just now starting to understand why it's so loaded. So now our next book obviously is going to be fixed in the way. It's going to be called Pillars of Protopia. And we're really zeroing in on why that's different, why it's so different. And even though that was always my initial goal, the word itself is so much better and so much stronger and has so much more deeper and important meaning to it.
I think like it's an important sort of, it may look subtle, but it's like sort of important crystallization of the idea. Because first of all, you sort of dump the number, because you realize that it could be like infinite, sort of, even like if you want to call something pillars, like you shouldn't presume that. And then the other part is like, you don't want to say utopia in the connotation of like the one best place to rule them all, but a protopia, or like also something that's like final, definitive at the end, and therefore not achievable. But something like Protopia is just like the next step, and it's multiple possible ideas or directions, even for like different ideas and directions for different people, which I think like sort of that's the modern response, or like the actually contemporary response to the utopianism, or it's one of its greatest flaws, is that no, we shouldn't try to do something like a world communism. Like that's not like, it's not going to be, if it's a thing that inherently will be hell for a whole bunch of people, even if it succeeds 100%, then it's like not the one goal that we should try to achieve. And maybe the core of the problem is that you're trying to achieve one world. Like maybe you should never try to achieve one world for all.
Yeah, then that's just to touch very briefly on that. The whole concept of a democratic world, where we are a kind of one world government, but there's all these little local governments that kind of have control over their own local problems. and it kind of grows up. I'm kind of a fan of that. We have, a fan of that concept of dominions, where every local government just maybe elects a leader for the town or a leader for your community, and it just keeps on going up to the point where everyone in the world has a say. But the key is transparency, and the key is kind of a free, equal vote that's not being brainwashed or controlled or bought out by somebody with more money or more power. Those are challenges, real challenges that we'd have to figure out before we ever could be successful with a world government. But
although I would say that it sort of changes just by introducing the concept of Protopia, because you're not just like judging it's either successful or it's not successful. Like Protopia allows you, with the Utopia, you can say that like, oh, we haven't achieved it. With Protopia, it's more like you can have a percentage, like whatever, like however you define what the successful next step is for anyone at any particular point in time or space or virtual reality. You can always judge it on some sort of scale. You don't have to say that like just like oh, so this worked or this didn't work. It's just maybe what we did, these things worked, these things didn't, and you can sort of iterate again. You just don't have to also make it an absolutist dilemma.
And that's what Kevin Kelly was focusing on in 2011 when he coined this term, is that we are already living in a version of Protopia where we are progressing. We have new technology every year. We've got iPhones, we've got VR, we've got new replicator 3D printer machines,
AI,
new AI. Every year we're seeing significant progress. And so absolutely, I think this is a Protopia, a version of it. And the concept that we're trying to really push out there is how to create more Protopia and more better Protopias.
Yeah,
better
I guess this is an important argument or framing, because usually people think of this world as a version of dystopia, because they clearly don't think of this as a version of utopia, unless like you're the one despot who's ruling over their own country or whatever. Then maybe it is for you, but like the bad old kind of utopia. But I think like the issue is like most people would tend to look at the negatives. I'm not saying it that like to ignore that there are problems in the world. Like, of course, there are many important big problems in the world that need to be addressed. But still, if you just adopt the different framework of looking at like how things are getting better and you focus on that to make them even more better, then I think it would put the world on a different trajectory. And when I say the world, it's just like each person's world, like whatever it means to them from their own point of view in their actions. Because moving toward Protopia is really about different individual people and collectives, but like not just the one people, but different people trying to make different steps toward different versions of what is better or progress for them. Because I think that's one of the issues that I also wanted to address. The word of like progress, because of course there is movement, political movement, progressivism, and it's another loaded term and another thing that like what you could ask, what does it even mean to be progressive? Because you say, oh, it's simple, we're going to progress, then like people will be, but look at progressives and the stupid things that they were or are currently arguing for. And it's just like, just because some group of people calls themselves progressives doesn't mean that they own what progress is or means, or that they are doing it correctly. It's that's why I think recently there's been a different term invented, the sort of instead of progressive left, because left is usually about being progressive historically in the basic political definition, then they called it a regressive left, like it's sort of people noticing that they started doing steps back in what the progress in terms of what progress was supposed to be. And because the progress was supposed to be toward more democracy and more liberalism, and they are doing a lot of stuff that's authoritarian, totalitarian, like the, again, old school utopian nonsense. So that then you should, that just because you're like, so it's important to sort of understand, just because somebody calls something progressive doesn't mean it's actually progress. That's like obviously clearly true. But also, just because you're changing things doesn't mean you're progressing either. So it's sort of really important to, I guess, for this Protopian idea, to have a good handle on what is progress. So it's like, how would you define progress in like an objective, universal way?
I think essentially it goes back to what we just said about more freedoms. If you're trying to take away people's freedoms to say, have free speech, for example, free speech is the big thing that some people say the progressives are trying to limit free speech. So again, it's complicated, but you'd argue that anything that takes away from those freedoms as long as it's, again, not the freedom to hurt others or the freedom to have hate speech and things like that. So that's the gray area. But I think
so there's to be clear then
that.
that's something that's called negative freedom theory, meaning that freedom is not like necessarily a freedom to be actively able to do stuff that somebody guarantees for you, but it's a freedom in a sense that you are free to do things within certain boundaries that are set so that you don't hurt other people. So as long as you're not hurting other people, you should have unlimited freedom, is the sort of liberal definition of freedom.
And that's the gray area that we have to constantly say is what hurts other people. If you have the freedom to commit suicide, for example, another really touchy topic, you're hurting all the people that love you in a very serious way. So
yeah, like of course, with these topics, I would just, as a debater, always say arguably, and because this is arguable and this is something to have a debate about. But yes, I do get your point.
Those are the tricky ones. But things like pollution, it's not that tricky. You shouldn't be free to pollute as much as you want all the time.
Yeah. You shouldn't be free to be a Captain Planet villain. Like if what you're doing in reality is being a caricature of a human being who's just doing cartoonish evil, then I guess maybe we should at least be able to agree on that. Not being the good kind of freedom.
And then, of course, the bullying parts of hate speech and even, free speech. If you're going to call people names and just be a total, douchebag is a good word all the time. Should you have the freedom to be a complete douchebag all the time, wherever you are? And that's a questionable gray area in some cases. Do we really want the world to be full of, hate speeching douchebags everywhere? Or should we have some kind of boundaries there? And that's the tricky part.
Yeah, no, that's like it's of course like I wasn't trying to imply that it's simple with like the progressives being regressive because maybe they're doing censorship. Like, of course, that's a reduction of the reality. There are maybe good reasons, especially in context of something like the pandemic, that maybe you could do harm if you're allowed to do some kind of speech. I think the example usually used is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Although that's actually funny. I've seen a lawyer explain that it's not actually true. Like, it's more complicated than that legally. Like, you could probably do that and wouldn't be illegal in the United States. It's just, sometimes just people the examples they use have like zero thought behind them. And if you actually thought about it, it's actually, you'd find out it's much more complicated than that. So maybe it's not a great example, like this particular one. I think like the better example would be if you're saying that, like, for instance, some group of people should be attacked. Like there's a much clearer example of like what should be probably illegal to say. But if you have any like version of democracy, like I don't think there's an issue if you have a sort of a political society that does elections or votes or in any way anything like that to express preferences of people living within that sort of sovereign collective or whatever it is. Then you can pass laws to have these various limitations for like safety and stuff. It's just that there's what I don't like today is that there's clearly a world, the world in which we live today is ruled by interests with a lot of money. And I think that's a controversial statement that most people who are not super rich or paid by super rich people would dispute. And the issue there is that what's more common, I think, than it maybe was in the more naive past, oftentimes, today is that some of these actors are very savvy, and so they're sort of using the words to mean their opposites all the time. And so they would like co-opt a term like progressivism, and they would try to argue that they should put in place all of these draconian measures that are clearly not progressive, and they would make sure to call that progressive. Yeah. Because partially to just cover up for it being the opposite, but also sometimes to just compromise the whole idea of there possibly being progress. And so I think that's actually the difficult thing to solve.
I think that's the challenge. And we could probably talk for hours about all these different directions and trying to detail exactly what does Protopia mean? What is good? What is bad with Protopia? And how do we define progression and Protopia kind of in the same light? So to attempt to do that a little briefly, I want to show the Protopian vision framework. Let me just link to it here. We'll take a quick look. This is written by Monica Bielski, I believe it's pronounced, something like that. Sorry, Monica. I'm going to share the screen.
Yeah, there's so many names to pronounce in the world. Just one can't get them all right, possibly.
And it's part of Medium. If you have, it's called the Protopia Futures Framework. Monica Bielski. A very good read, published about 2 years ago. Her and about 20 other people worked on this together through the pandemic, kind of came up with a decent framework for Protopia. I'm very excited. I'm excited to meet them all soon and kind of connect with them in different ways. But I just wanted to jump down through first. So the first, futures in plural, imagination. We have to kind of just imagine.
No, just the headings or the titles or the captions are actually basically summing it up very well.
Yeah, I wanted to jump down. It talks about Utopia and Protopia. Why Protopia? We've already talked a lot about that already. Proactive, prototyping, hopeful future. So here's the 6, the principles of Protopia that I wanted to just touch on very briefly. So the core principles that they came up with was 1, plurality beyond binaries. We've already mentioned that a little bit, but this also kind of talks a little bit more about the racism, sexism, colorism, xenophobia, homophobia, all these different kinds of things that, again, can go too far if you're trying to say people can't talk about those things or people can't mention those things, because it's important to be able to discuss them and debate them and figure out what is good, what is not good, what is hate speech, what is not hate speech, and all these types of things. But the key is the plurality, is just being open-minded, live and let live kind of mentality, golden rule kind of mentality, where we're not about judging each other. It's about trying to let each other have as much freedom as possible.
Yeah, no, I think the whole problem with the binaries is like basically it's the sort of dualities or dichotomies are basically very easy to use as like to create conflict between groups of people. It's the sort of divide and conquer strategy. Like you don't want to have divisive things operating in the world.
We've talked a lot before about how to try to unite the world in a non-binary way, where there's no one way of doing things, but we can at least unite ourselves together in a way of not killing each other or not hurting each other, and try to make
or just like where you don't think
everybody
in terms of like simple us versus them tribal stuff.
Yeah, it's a we. And she talks a lot about using the we word for almost everything. We believe in Protopia. We believe in a better world for everyone. We believe that we can all create our own Protopian paradises. Paradise is another kind of core word that in some ways it's synonymous with utopia, because it's not really
But
clear
that also
what it
has
is.
like the religious bias.
Yeah, and the paradise of
baggage.
like a tropical paradise, your own island with your own set of people and rules and laws.
It shouldn't be about people saying, I want to be a philosopher king.
Yes. So the concept is it's protopian in the way that it's not binary, and it's a plural thing. Number 2 kind of builds that a little bit more, community beyond borders. The idea of, I think, eventually eliminating all countries' borders. You could have kind of, again, communities and areas that are kind of governed by different levels of government, different, different groups, different, I guess, seed cores or different dominions, I guess you can call them, different dominions that kind of control their own area, but really moving beyond that, where people can kind of move anywhere they want to move.
No, I think like the people keep talking about, especially even when I was studying political science many years ago, people were already talking about, people, I mean like political scientists or philosophers, like for a while been talking about like sort of the death of the nation state. And I think it's not really going to, I think it is sort of already happening and going to happen fairly quickly, but also I don't think it's going to mean exactly what people think it means. It's like, I don't think it means you won't have things like a Czech Republic, I think, or Canada. I think you will have those still entities existing, much like anything that was invented in the ancient past still exists somewhere. Like you still have kingdoms, even though the world moved beyond kingdoms. I just think that what it means is that like there will be a point at which it will stop mattering that like you're the nationality because you were born there. Right. I think like these sort of arbitrary elements of it will be like, I think it will move more toward like a voluntary being part of, like voluntarily of a political community. Will be more of a thing.
If every country in the world is kind of okay or relatively good in a protopian ideal, they're not all identical, but they're all kind of decent, and they believe in freedom of the human, safety and all the good things, education, the good things that humans like, and they're all kind of decent, then immigration and stuff like that becomes much easier. You don't have to worry so much about trying to keep out the bad people and bring
it sort of will not be as heated or polarizing. It will just be a thing that happens that nobody mostly cares about.
Yeah, we just kind of allow more free movement. So again, that's a little bit ways out perhaps, but it's definitely a concept that we want to talk about in Protopia, is how to move towards a world where there's less us versus them mentalities, and we're all one community, and each small community can be a part of that, but the community is the hero of the future, is really what it comes down to. It's not an individualistic thing. It's we're in this together. So that's another core concept. Number 3, celebration of presence. This is kind of an interesting one. Our futures are embodied and interdependent. We revel in expanded sensory experiences and consciously make vital space for neurodiverse and disability inclusive expressions of intimacy, care, and radical tenderness. This is kind of a little hard to wrap your mind around exactly what this means, but I get the concept. It's
Yeah,
for me,
I think sure. I think this is one of the things that like philosophers would like just have a field day with a little bit, because like what you need to do in philosophy is very precise definitions of stuff. So I think this combines a bunch of different things. So I think this point needs more work in terms of like development of ideas.
She does get into all of them a little bit more down lower, so you can kind of read that. We don't have time to read through it all today,
sure.
But there is a lot.
But maybe even if you just look at this one, like just the bullet points.
Yeah, agreed. So then the fourth one, regenerative action and life as technology. This was kind of interesting to me as well, where you kind of you're just recognizing that we've been pretty destructive up till now. We've kind of been plundering the earth for the last 100 years with our capitalist ideals. And not to say capitalism is bad, but we kind of need a re-envisioning of how the economy of the protopian futures might work. How to kind of bring laws that can keep us all safer in the long term, and getting more positive feedback loops, more cyclical and circular creation, circular industries, where you're basically recycling everything and reusing everything, and turning everything into a sustainable system.
Yeah,
So
I've been like nursing a term or developing a term of my own. I think that I want to use in my own science fiction that I'm developing. I think what you could call it is like the problem of our technology so far was that it was incomplete, like an incomplete science and incomplete technology. Any technology that doesn't take into account the environment and these like systems and loops within which it exists, like I would call incomplete, and the solution is to make it more complete. Like I wouldn't necessarily reduce it to biological even, or just organic metaphor, even though of course that is the next step metaphor. Like if you've been very mechanical or cybernetic so far, like the better understanding or level of framing technology is to make it organic. That sort of makes sense. But I think it's this, even you could move beyond that. Like I think beyond organic, you could move toward more like a spiritual technology, I think, almost. So like I would use the term for this thing, I would just use the term like an incomplete science and technology is bad and should be made more complete.
I like that. I like the concept of just trying to combine them a little bit, where precision fermentation is one of the core ones that I really love. Any kind of replicator technology is going to use some kind of atoms and maybe some kind of a life to build whatever it is you want to build. And you're kind of using this various AI merging with life. You're using the DNA of protein structures that can feed us, and kind of having them grow themselves.
It's a bit like in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You don't have to build or manufacture anything because it grows somewhere in the universe.
Yeah, there's always some DNA somewhere that's growing exactly what it is you need to survive. And there's obviously dystopian versions of that with like the Zerg or insects taking over everything. But if we can kind of control it well and do it well, there are good ways to do it. And there's protopian ways to kind of use this life as technology and kind of combine the two in a good, spiritually good way. So that's kind of leads us into number 5, which is the symbiotic spirituality. And we definitely appreciate the importance of the spiritual practices from the dawn of humanity and their role in human culture making. We therefore quest for spiritual practices that acknowledge ancestral wisdom while also expanding rather than stifling scientific inquiry. This is an extremely important point for me too, that we don't use science, like the whole creationism debate. It doesn't really matter in my mind. Like it's kind of the way they talk about evolution versus creationism, and trying to say my religion is the only one that's right, and all these concepts that lead us towards war.
Yeah, I would just use the like quotation marks for debate.
Yeah.
Like I don't think it has many features of an actual debate. I would just to this, I would say that I think there are some good steps, more and also specific steps happening lately in this sort of merging of this sort of ancient outlook and modern science, or reforming modern science to be more, I guess, also complete in the sense of like taking into account all the spiritual understanding. Because recently you had all of the sort of UFO Congress hearings and the how to call it, reinterpretations of like how far into the past the history of civilization actually goes and stuff, like because like new evidence is showing up. And I think it's sort of interesting. It's not pushed forward by more debate. It's being pushed forward by new evidence. So there's like a new evidence that's actually making even like more skeptically minded scientists reconsider a lot of the sort of paradigmatic ideas in science as it was happening since the Enlightenment in the modern period. So I think this is actually kind of already starting to happen in practical terms, like being more open to, because like, for instance, the debate between creationism and just like the idea in evolutionary theory that stuff just happened by itself and evolved. And it's, I think if you put into the equation something like the idea, well, maybe there are, intelligent advanced aliens in this area of space and have been here for like 500 million years, and that doesn't contradict any scientific theories of what's possible, that just could be possible, could have been happening, then the ideas of like spiritualism and science come even closer together. That you could have this idea that like, yeah, there are sort of not intelligent processes that can develop a lot of stuff in the universe, but you also have to always be open to the possible of some sort of intelligent intervention, possibility of intelligent intervention, because that's also technically not contrary to the whole scientific framework of what's possible.
Yeah, at its core, I think it comes down to not judging any religion or spiritual practice, let's say, too harshly. We all have to kind of choose what's right for us, choose whether religion is good for us or true to us in whatever way. But I don't think we should ever say to other people, your religion is bad or your spiritual practice is bad. You should do it my way. You can argue it. And
I think you can argue that a practice is bad, but because like all kinds of religions are not just a practice or one practice, or there are different ways how to do things. Like you can interpret almost any religion in a way that like, oh, I should conquer all other peoples for the greater glory of my God. And I think like that's a bad practice. I think like you can say that's not a good practice, but you can practice any religion in many ways that are fine.
One of the articles of faith of the Mormon faith, which I'm a Mormon, it's we claim the right of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and we allow all others that same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. And to me, that's a really core concept that every religion really needs to internalize, not just say, not just kind of have it there, but really internalize it, that we allow everybody to practice their spirituality however it is they choose, as long as they're not hurting or infringing upon other people's right to practice their spirituality. So I think that's very good. The symbiotic nature of all these spiritual and religious practices is a very big and important thing.
But I think that's true also of something like a scientific skepticism. You can have something like a radical scientism, which is also similar to aggressive interpretations of religions that are just trying to shut down everyone else who's doing a different thing, and you just believe that you have the only like truth that anybody can have in the universe and stuff. I think like it's sort of in a way in which even science can be turned into a religion. Like it could be bad in any way in which any religion could be bad. That's why I do like the word like symbiotic, because like what it really I think should be about is like finding a way for these things to coexist and take the best out of all of them. Rather than just having the one true thing. Because when you think that, again, with the Utopia in general, if you think you have the one true thing that's best for everyone, then you're probably being a bad person.
Yeah, if you're force feeding anyone, anything really, it's about, you can debate and argue it, and you can kind of do missionary proselytizing work. I'm okay with all that. I was a missionary in Japan for 2 years myself. But it's about how you do it. It's about doing it respectfully and lovingly, and in a way of service. You're trying to teach or help people to learn something maybe they didn't know about.
I'll say one thing: I was never offended by Mormons doing missionary work anywhere that I've met them, and I've met a whole bunch of them in the Czech Republic specifically, because like I think the way the Mormons do it is extremely respectful of the main thing why I even started talking at one point to Mormon missionaries in Brno, was because they addressed me in very good Czech. And I was actually quite impressed by that, because like learning, like for a high school person who's not a native Czech speaker, to learn Czech language to a degree that I won't immediately recognize that they're not actually a Czech person, like that's a massive accomplishment. And it really shows a a high degree of respect for the heathen culture that they came to proselytize to. Like, especially by Mormon standards, I think like Czech culture has like a bunch of no-nos. Like, we're actually pretty alcoholic and stuff. So I think that like it's such a good example of like how if you kept doing it this way, like if it like various religions were just like doing missionary work in this way, I don't think like most people would mind. Like because like but just to be specific, like what the Mormon missionaries in my experience would do was to like invite you to have like I don't know, like a cake and play like table tennis with them or something, or in one case Magic the Gathering actually, which was hilarious. So it's like if like it was actually like a fun social program that's not being like extremely judgmental, then I think it just worked pretty well.
It was called Build Relationships of Trust. It's all about just helping one another, trust one another. And then, you know, if you have something to share and they're curious, then you can kind of answer those questions. And I think if that was the key way of spreading any kind of knowledge and or religion or any idea about practices, is just kind of show it with your life first. You show, this has been good for my life. This is what's worked for me. I want to be your friend. I want to learn what works for you. And I want to share anything well that works well for me. And I think that's a very important concept in Protopian Futures, is that we're all sharing and we're all kind of caring about each other, learning about each other, and building the best cultures as possible.
Yeah, like if Mormons were sending conquistadors instead, then I would probably mind.
Yes, our practice is to always run when people threaten us. We shouldn't ever fight. That's what they tell all the missionaries to do. Just run.
Great.
You have to we exercise quite well. I was doing 100 push-ups a day when I was on my mission. We're good runners. We can definitely run away from bad situations whenever someone threatens us. And I think that's
hilarious. And also a great practice. I think that's a good practice.
Yeah, one of my best friends growing up, he actually was in France. He was running away from a gang one time, and he ended up losing his middle finger jumping over a fence. Got caught in the ring, but he managed to find it, and they stitched it back on, so it was good. But it's a good story. It's a good story for how you should always run. Well, but be careful when you're hopping over fences. Anyway, next one. We're almost there. We're getting there. So 6, creativity and emergent subcultures. From the interwoven journeys of our ancestors to the future living fabrics of our cities, we celebrate the role of creativity beyond the elitism of disciplines previously labeled as artistic. This is, again, a little bit vague. It gets into a little more details below, but it's just really, again, about being creative, being imaginative, figuring out different ways of building our cities, the future.
Sure, I just it's probably not the best to have in a manifesto like this have something phrased in a way that's sort of like a throwing shade at someone. I think there's somebody. It feels a little bit like somebody was actually hurt by a particular group of people, and getting back at them a little bit.
That's a good point. Yeah, we definitely have to be careful with the words we use, that we're not trying to zero in on any bad person, individual, or practice directly.
Yeah, because like I think there's an issue like this sort of list so far is like half pretty good, and but like I guess 3/4 pretty good, and like there's like a 1/4 of like things that probably should be ironed out, in my opinion, a little bit, because they're a bit partially a bit vague. Like I'm not even entirely sure what this means. So especially if you want to condense it to like one paragraph, it should be probably a bit clearer. And feels like it's a couple of different ideas. Like creativity is one thing, but problem with elitism is a different thing. I think it's just like combined a bit too much into different things. I guess it could be more explained in the more points.
Here's broken down into 4 points anyway, briefly. So creativity of our youth must be encouraged, I think, is a definitely core concept. We shouldn't be trying to brainwash our kids to think the old ways or whatever. We should just kind of focus on new ideas and new ways of thinking.
But I think like this looks like a set of a somewhat disparate ideas. I like a fairly good ideas, but I think let me look at the second one a bit more. The world has never seen such an explosion and emergence of new subcultures, yet our future narratives, technologies, efforts, and our design remain mostly ignorant. That this is a bit like I would have some questions like about this. I would have some questions.
This is definitely one of the more complicated ones, let's just say, and this can dig really deep. But I do like the idea of creativity being a core concept.
Sure. No, I do. I like the point number one. I think like the main point of this should be the point number one, which is that creativity is actually the ultimate skill for like having a career in the future. Probably, like I would 100% agree with that.
Okay, Great. So just a couple more quick points. So we talked
Mm-hmm.
about creativity. Oh, and the seventh one here.
Yeah.
Evolution of values, culture of contribution. We must depart from the colonial, neocolonial, individualist cultures of exploitation and greed and endeavor to nurture cultures of equity, contribution, and planetary mutuality. I actually like this one quite a bit.
Yep. No.
We envision the values of a material degrowth society. Degrowth is kind of a
Mm.
one I'm not a huge fan of, because I feel like it's a lot of people see that as going back to living in caves or going back and living like Amish people or whatever, and which I'm definitely not a fan of, I have to say. It's teach their own. I'm not, if people want to live like that, I think that's okay. But personally,
Like sure, like it's very, very doable, probably for a community of people who wants to do something like it to be allowed to do something like it somewhere. That's not the problem.
Absolutely, and I definitely want that to be a part of Protopian visions, that you have these communities that are focused on, living without technology if they so choose. But the whole degrowth concept as a concept is a tricky one, because I do believe it is possible to have infinite growth in an infinite universe, that we just have to go to other solar systems or other asteroids.
Yeah,
Obviously,
the universe is growing literally infinitely.
Yeah, so the whole degrowth concept I kind of disagree with. I think it's about sustainable growth, and it's about not growing too fast and dying in the process.
Or maybe having a better idea of growth, because I think like the big part of the problem of the concept of growth so far for me was that it was just like measured in terms of GDP. Like I think like you could have a bad conception of what growth means. Like if by growth you mean that people will be like Protopia in general, like people will be doing better over time. Like I think there was some, I forgot who, maybe it was the Czech economist Tomáš Sedláček. He has a very qualitative ideas about economics, but like qualitative idea of like some sort of a qualitative GDP, meaning that what you're measuring is actually like how well people are doing, and you're trying to increase that over time. And then you don't have to necessarily mean growth as like infinite, I don't know, mining of more ores or something like crude or dumb like that. But you sort of have a concept of what more and better means and maximizing it. But you can have a concept of that is fundamentally compatible with even a finite Earth. It's just, but also if you go into space, then like literally you can expand. Well, I guess until you run into aliens, and then you may want not to be colonial again, I guess.
Yeah, and she makes the point here that the sole civilization aspect in which we could encourage infinite growth is knowledge. And knowledge, and say progression of knowledge and progression of
because
experience.
Information technically could be basically near infinite.
Yeah, so I think that's an important distinction. She does make it a little bit clearer here, but the whole degrowth as a word is a bit of a loaded word, and I think you have to be careful with how you use it.
Also, generally don't like just like using negative words as what we're supposed to be doing in the future. It's not very, at the very least, it's not very motivational. I think that's why.
I'm definitely a huge supporter of kind of changing this capitalist model of the current economy, like explained here. Infinite growth on a finite planet is very destructive, unsustainable, and deadly. So I definitely agree with all of that 100%, and that we have to kind of re-envision how we want our growth GDP to kind of matter. I'm definitely a fan of some kind of general progress indicator or general happiness index, or even though those are all complicated in their own ways, but just something beyond GDP as a way of measuring growth and progression, I think is extremely important.
Because like you can factor in stuff that's like information based into it a lot, in which case you will probably not run out of information, even like theoretically.
So that's the core, that's the final point then. Then she kind of goes deeper a little bit, but jumping back to the 7, there we go. Plurality, community, celebration of presence, regenerative action, life as technology, symbiotic spirituality, creativity and emergent subcultures, and evolution of cultural values. Pretty good stuff. So I think that's kind of, again, a baseline for where Protopia could be. It doesn't mean it's just this. It's just kind of a good baseline to build upon and to dig deeper on, and help kind of define what Protopia means, what progression means.
Like I would just say that like from like just that strict like elite academician philosopher point of view, like it probably needs to be ironed out in some places a little bit. But like you said, it's good stuff. And like overall, it's pretty good.
So I think we'll try to wrap it up there for this week. Thanks so much for joining us on our first discussion of what Protopia means to us. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it more and more as we get deeper into all the different discussions, and now you can kind of go back and watch all of our past videos with this concept in mind, that this is really what we're pushing forward, is these Protopian visions of what the world could look like and what different versions of better worlds might be. So please let us know, what's your Protopian vision? Reach out to us, talk to us, let us know what kind of videos you'd like to see on how to build Protopian futures.
Or what are your thoughts about the concept of Protopia as such?
Absolutely. And try to use the word. Talk to your friends. See if any of your friends have ever heard the word. Get it out there. Hopefully within another decade, this word will be commonly used, or sooner, perhaps, that everybody will know what Protopia means. And we can kind of move away from the whole utopia, dystopia, binary concept.
Be a missionary for Protopianism.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for joining us today. Always love having you with us, and I love sharing all our ideas. And Martin, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion today. It was a blast. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk again soon. Let's build the Protopian futures together as we save the world.